Hey everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Dice Roll Drama, where we are going to be making our maps for our Nine Realms campaign out of rice and using dice. But that does come with the territory of potential concerns. And if at any point during today's episode you are worried that did Dice Roll Drama waste 36 cups of rice on this little art project, I can assure you I did not. This is the device rescue rice that I have on hand for whenever my phone gets wet, and I decided to use it for crafting. Before we go into the details of our process for today, I would like to give a quick shout out to the Cozy Art Teacher blog for explaining the process of making maps using rice, and to Instructables.com for explaining the details of making maps using dice. Today we're just going to be making the larger scale maps. So like smaller things like town maps or like filling out the maps with details. We're going to save that for Tuesday's discussion. But that's not to say that I won't be putting any details on the map. That's where the dice come in. In advance, in order to avoid any potential bias, I have set up corresponding points of interest or interactable pieces of the terrain that relate to each of these dice. So wherever the dice land, we'll put one of those. But onto the making of like the main maps. This is semi-randomized because I caught myself being too controlling when I was trying to make the maps the standard way. So what I did instead was I got a bunch of randomized shapes. Now, you know with me with randomizers what that means, but just in case you guys haven't seen session 0, I use AI to make custom randomizers because of a cybersecurity concern. I do not want my laptop getting a virus from an internet randomizer. The details of today's randomizer are as follows. I want 4 random 2D shapes. And I asked this same question 10 times on accident. It was only supposed to be 9, so we're only using the first 9, but we, as a result, have 36 random shapes that we're going to need to draw using the rice. Now you may be wondering about the 4 or the 36 in there. Each realm is going to get 4 of these randomized shapes. And it lines up with the region encounter table that I showcased in session 0, where 1 through 4 is mid-yard shapes, 5 through 8 is Vanaheim's shapes, and so on. What we're going to do is once we have the outlines of the maps, of the shapes, we are going to mix and match and mess around with the 4 shapes that correspond to a respective region. And we'll find some sort of layout that makes a good or fun little map. With this complete, we will then roll the dice. And this is where the dice come in, because every time after I've drawn a shape, I will roll the dice across the same board that the rice shape is on. Not at the same time, because that would make a mess, but the whole idea is that if these dice land on the rice shape outline, then we put the points of interest corresponding to these dice there. If they land off of the outline, then we just don't place a point. So that's our process explained. However, I do want to give you guys a full screen view of the art, which means that I'm going to be stepping back from being in front of the camera, but I'll still be talking. So with that, let's switch screens and start discussing. I'd like to get this said sooner rather than later. My sources, when I was trying to find lore about the actual 9 realms, are heritagedaily.com and worldhistory.org. I'm going to give you guys a key that I'd like for you to keep in mind just to avoid confusion later. D4 is equivalent to 1 on a table. D6 is equivalent to 2 on a table. D8, 3, D10, 4, D12, 5, D20, 6, and percentile dice are 7. We have a handful of different tables, but they each correspond to one of the respective dice. Midgard is going to be a good starting point. In Dragons the Nine Realms, this seems to be the Icarus research town. So the real world lore of Midgard, it's where we live. It's where humans live, and it's said to be the realm in which Ragnarok takes place, which is basically the end of the world in Norse mythology. I bring up Ragnarok because of how it relates to Jormungandr. This was the final boss of the Dragons the Nine Realms TV series, but he's in the wrong spot, kinda. He's supposed to live in Midgard, not Helheim. And in his lore, it's said that he is a serpent so large he can encircle the ocean and bite his own tail. But those were lore points that stood out to me when I was doing my research for this. But my features for the Midgard expansion pack, let's call it, is going to be fairly standard and, fairly recognizable in the context of the human world. The features are as follows. 1 is a clearing, 2 is a pond, 3 is a lake, 4 is buildings, 5 is a crevice, 6 is ruins, and 7 is ruins. And now, let me go ahead and describe that for you. Imagine yourself standing on a very large, grassy hill. There's a couple towns within sight of you, but you're not facing them. Instead, you are facing a mass of ice. And the hill does, somewhat steeply, come down to meet this massive glacier. But you dare not step onto the field of ice and rock. Because it is littered with cracks and crevices that dip down who knows how far. And that is my original imagining for Midgard. Next, we're going to be talking about Vanaheim. When it comes to the real world lore for Vanaheim, we don't have a ton in the way of descriptions, but we do have some idea of what Vanaheim, or the Vanir, the gods who lived there, were associated with. You may see that I mentioned the Vanir and the war with Asgard in my little lore notes. That did happen, and I felt like I should write it down, but I really want to go more into depth on their associations. Vanaheim has associations with seeing the future. It has associations with fertility of plants. And the Vanir are also associated with wisdom. Worldhistory.org also suggested that Vanaheim has good lighting. And now we get 2 features. 1 and 2 are both freestanding crystals, because I was thinking of associations with seeing the future, and one of those is runestones. 3 is pond because of the, plant life association, and that's also why 4 is vines. 5 and 7 are listed as plant life. This is specifically referring to new plant life. Dragons the Nine Realms did actually introduce new plants in the Dragon World. 6 is salt flats, and I chose that because they have a mirror-like effect if they have a little bit of water on them. I guess let's say mirrors relate to wisdom because self-awareness? Anyway, for the description, you're standing on a very reflective salt flat. There's just a tiny bit of water lapping at your shoes, even. And just before you, is a drop-off into a massive lake, though it would be better described as a brine pool. And surrounding this lake are salt formations, some bearing resemblance to stalactites or stalagmites, and others to hills. The walls of this place have some variation, and they appear to mostly be limestone, but it's as though something has come by in the past and reinforced them with lava rock. And way up at the top is a rim of plant life. Now, that's not to say that the ground you're standing on is completely devoid of plants, but they definitely grow as though they are avoiding the salt flats. Where salt ends, plants begin. So that is my description for Vanaheim. Next, we'll talk about Muspelheim. There's a couple lore points I wanted to bring up with Muspelheim. The confusion is just there because it's not just scientists who can't agree on 90% of the content in their field, but the two lore points are fire. This is coming from the Edda's interpretation of Muspelheim as being a fire realm. Giants, there is an important character in Norse mythology. There is a character in Norse mythology who, it sounds like he was a giant, and he plays a role in Ragnarok. The Eddas listed him as being Surtur, but worldhistory.org referred to him as Muspel. So I'll acknowledge the confusion, but since Dragons of the Nine Realms went with the fire and Surtur interpretation of Muspelheim, I felt the need to stay accurate to that, but I also wanted to bring up the debate. There's going to be a few repeating features on a few of the maps. It kind of depends on thinking of it from the standpoint of D&D. But what we have is double obsidian spawns in the form of 1 and 2 being obsidian, double metal in 3 and 4. 5 is going to be a nest. This refers to a few of the sort of treasure hoarding types of dragons that we see in the franchise, like the Smothering Smoke Breath. And 6 and 7 we have fossils. Now here's the Muspelheim description. You are standing on a rock pillar. Stretched out below you seems to be a massive field or desert or whatnot of volcanic rock. But you aren't fooled, and you wouldn't want to traverse this field on foot. It's really just a thin crust over a bunch of lava tubes that have once again refilled. And you can see this from the occasional time where a weak spot breaks down and falls through into the lava below. Surrounding you are tons of other spots where the rocks are jutting up, be that to form pillars or plateaus or whatnot, and many of them have varying colors of fire. Blue as sulfur is burning, or green as copper is burning, and so on. And on your own pillar, there's sand comprised of the inky glass obsidian. Before I talk about Niflheim, I do want to clear up some upcoming confusion. The realm that the kids encounter in Season 4, the Ice Realm, is Niflheim. And we know that it's Niflheim over Jotunheim, a similar realm, because Season 6's realm is referred to as the Giant Realm. But as far as lore points for Niflheim go, it has a lot of mist and ice. Judging from its descriptions, it sounds to be pretty empty. So our features are 1, a frozen dragon, 2, fossils, 3, a snowdrift, 4, ruins, 5, again fossils, 6 is crystals, and 7 is abandoned equipment. Now, if you couldn't guess from that last one, my version of Niflheim on the map is going to be inside the Bewilderbeast Glacier. And here's a description of it. You're ascending in an elevator as the tide is coming in. water comes cascading over ice pillars that almost appear like mushrooms. You are riding an ascending elevator as the tide is coming in to flood the ground that you were literally just standing on. The fog's still a bit heavy, enough to be a pale gray, but you can see a bit better. In the distance is a crevasse which is swiftly turning into a waterfall, and from the other side the water is pouring in and through some ice pillars that are vaguely shaped like mushrooms. When you turn around to face the wall that the elevator is attached to, the ice is see-through for a decent distance, though it has varying little pockets inside it, as though it froze an air bubble or as though something has been tunneling around in it. To one side, perhaps almost a trick of your eyes, the fog seems darker for just a moment, as though there's some obscured thing on just the other side. But when you rub your eyes to see if it's just imagined, when you look back, there's nothing there. That will be our description for Niflheim. Moving on to Alfheim, the real-world lore, it has some connection to light and music, that being from its residents, the elves. There is a theory that Alfheim was inspired by a place that's geographically between a couple of rivers. And Alfheim also is associated with Freyr, who was also from Vanaheim. For features, we have 1, which is delta, 2, which is sinkholes, 3 is fire crystals. This is actually the dragon sight from the original show. And if you haven't seen enough of the show, dragon sight is reactive to fire, and it glows and produces oxygen. 4 is a grove of hidden world plants, 5 is a grove of hidden world plants, 6 is deep water, and 7 is fire crystals. On to the description. The cave entrance behind you is thick with vines. Out ahead of you is what must naturally be a lake, but it's dotted with slumbering dragons. They appear almost as islands, given their size and given the varying plants that they cultivate on their backs. The entire cave itself has a light layer of mist, but certainly not as much as Niflheim. On the other side of this lake, you can see parts of a delta where there are spots of land that have jungle-like plants on them. Though, perhaps alarmingly, there's some amount of carnivorous plants growing there. Much of the cavern appears to be clay, especially given that there are spots where, were you to walk, you would plunge knee-deep into a tunnel. And that will be Alfheim. Next is Jotunheim. Poor Jotunheim, man. This place was super important in Norse mythology, or at least it seemed to be, because quite a few myths actually happen there. But in the original show, they had a good idea in mind. They put a bunch of gigantic plants and gigantic dragons in Jotunheim. That is quite appropriate for a realm that is associated with chaos, but they forgot about the cold part, I guess. Let's look at the lore. Jotunheim is the home of the Jotun. It's supposed to be forested and cold, although it does have mountains, which is why when Season 4 was released in Dragons: The Nine Realms, Jotunheim was seemingly the realm they were exploring. It does have at least one river in it. It also has a stronghold where at least some of the Jotun live. Jotunheim also has a well, which Odin made a sacrifice to. When it comes to features, we have 2 spots for hot springs, those being 1 and 2. 3 is ice sheets, and 4 is mountains. I don't have in mind, like, literal mountains. I was more interpreting it as, like, an artist having fun with perspective, where it looks like there's gigantic mountains, but that's only because our ability to interpret the land is being messed with by angles and stuff, which would be totally fun from a design standpoint. We do have 5 for turbulent water, 6 is also mountains, and 7 is also rapids. When it comes to a description, you're gazing upon a truly vast and somewhat intimidating place. If the land inside this icy realm were sentient, it would almost appear as though it was trying to mimic Utah or Yellowstone, because it certainly isn't lacking in icy arches and in masses of ice and snow which have formed over boulders, as though in an attempt to consume them. There's a massive waterfall at the heart of it all, though only visible during high tide, when the ocean pours in from above. Far in the distance is a true mountain, or what should be a true mountain, but you dare not go over there because you can see steam sort of pouring from the top of the mountain, but also from various points which must be vents that surround the base. The local flora, too, is a bit intimidating. Many of them bear some resemblance to Venus flytraps or pitcher plants, so you suspect they might be carnivorous. And that is Jotunheim. Now let's move on to Svartalheim. Dragons the Nine Realms called Helheim the Dark Realm, but I think that might be more appropriate for Svartalheim, which is, in its lore associated with being dark. It is where the dwarves live, so it is associated with forging and mining, and also with magic items. Now, I don't actually take issue with the fact that the writers didn't want Svartalheim to be visibly dark in the original show. In fact, it's a breath of fresh air after all of those films that have come out recently where they're like, we want realistic lighting, and then you can't see half of what's on the screen. So they get a pass for lighting it up, but I'm still going to, in my design, respect the fact that it is dark as best I can. But now let's talk about features, and you'll get an idea of how I'm going to do that. First of all, we have feature 1, a glow crystal patch. I absolutely, for the life of me, could not pull the name Dragonsight out of wherever it was hiding in my brain. Then we have 2 and 3, which are going to be glow pools. And this refers to pools of the Flightmare algae. The Flightmare dragon's the dragon I described in session 0. And they eat glowing algae. But the fun thing is, when any dragon eats this, Flightmare or not, it glows. Can you imagine how much fun it would have been if they'd used glowing dragons to navigate Svartalheim in the original show? Just a thought. Then for 4 we have vents, and this is specifically vents that connect to Muspelheim. So you'd have a little bit of lava light coming out of them. 5 is metal, 6 is plants, specifically the glowing ones that they introduced in Dragons the Nine Realms, and then 7 is obsidian. Now let's describe Svartalheim. You're wading into a glowing river. This river stretches far to either side of the horizon. If the faint glow out in the distance on either side of you is anything to go by. But to step too far away from this glowing river would be to step into total darkness, or at times semi-darkness. It's like you're surrounded on all sides by stars, because there are little hints of orange light, of blue light on the walls, on the ground, but who knows what lies in between the river and them. The bottom of the river is quite soft, but in places quite deep. It appears as though this place is covered by the remnants and the runoff from Muspelheim, because all of the dirt is volcanic in origin. And if you were to dig down just a couple feet, you'd even find granite. If you were to use a flashlight and swing it around, the light would catch on a very odd sight. Metal. On its own, perhaps quite normal, but for the volume of it, and for the fact that some of it is in its refined form, it is quite a strange and wondrous thing to behold. That is Svartalfheim, so our next realm is Helheim. Helheim does actually have a couple spots in Norse myth where it shows up that I could find. I'm sure there's more. And the lore that sticks out to me is its heavy association with the afterlife. Like, sure, Asgard has some association with the afterlife too, in the form of Valhalla, but Valhalla is just one part of Asgard. So, heavy associations with the afterlife for Helheim. On the way to, or maybe inside of, it was a little hard to interpret, Helheim has a metal river. It's also known for being dark. I guess I was a little too hard on Dragons in the Nine Realms for that one then. And it's also somewhere under the World Tree. Then we have features. 1 is fossils. 2 is ruins. 3 is nest. 4 is sandbar. 5 is fossils. 6 is high point. 7, molten metal. I'll explain myself on a couple of these. 7 is molten metal in relation to that metal river I told you about. 3, nest is, again, dragons like the Smothering Smoke Breath, or dragons like the Sandbuster, both of them hoard treasure. Ruins is, in my original design for Helheim, I imagined a giant dragon living there, the alpha dragon of that respective realm, and the whole idea was that it had a stalagmite breath, so whatever it breathed on, it covered in stalagmites. And I imagined it doing this to some ships that wandered into the hidden world at some point in the missing 1300 years from the franchise. It froze the ships, not the people on the ships, if that's comforting to you. And when I was designing my interpretation of the Helheim realm, and specifically designing this dragon, I was imagining something reminiscent of the Sentinels and their island in Race to the Edge, since that's the only lore we have on dragon burial practices. So Helheim would be like that island. Dragons instinctively go there when their time is almost up. The giant Helheim dragon plays a similar role to the Sentinels. It guards against any potential threats to the dragons of its home, hence why it would freeze these ships. In that interpretation, as long as it wasn't, like, mad, the Helheim dragon would behave very similar to the Sentinels, in that it takes care of their burial site. So now for a description of Helheim. You're in a kayak, and you stumbled in here accidentally. You have a sea cave behind you that has a little bit of a waterfall, the reasoning that you discovered this place to begin with. Up ahead is a large expanse of water. It seems as though this place fills up with the tides, but never fully empties, unlike in Niflheim. There are many places that rise above the water level, however, and many appear to have strange statues on them. But you definitely aren't keen to get out of your kayak and explore. When your kayak glides over a deeper section of the water, there's some movement below you, causing a little bit of ripples and waves, and also lighting part of the place up. As it turns out, there's bioluminescence within the water. That is the Helheim realm. When it comes to Asgard, Dragons of the Nine Realms made a remarkably funny oversight when they were designing it. And that was to make it completely empty of life, well, save for some mushrooms, and save for the nightlights. The thing is, that implies that these dragons just, like, eat literally everything in sight, which doesn't pair too well with the pacifist character and all the virtue stuff they were doing with the nightlights. I just thought I'd bring that up before I go into detail about Asgard. With lore, it's known for having treasure. It also has Valhalla, which is an afterlife. But like I mentioned, Helheim is associated with the afterlife much more so than Asgard. There's a lot of gods and goddesses who we know live in Valhalla, in Norse myth, and it also has the Bifrost, which is supposed to connect our world to the world of the gods. When we get to features, 1 is metal, 2 is pillars, 3 is nest, 4 is crystals, 5 is lakes, 6 is ponds, 7 is more pillars. I might be banking on luck a little too much on this one. I am kind of hoping that the pillars give us some way to like represent Valhalla. That would be really cool. The pillars are a little bit misleading. It would probably be more appropriate to call it nest, at least for the second one. So 7. And that's because these would be dragon-made pillars. From what we know about the Death Song dragon, they make their nest out of amber. That seems really appropriate for a realm that's associated with treasure. So that's what that was all about. And now let's describe Asgard. The entrance to this place is otherworldly, and perhaps it was made by the dragons. Because varying thin-ish sheets of metal cover the walls, forming little spots where the dragons may rest or where water might collect, a bit like those mushrooms that grow on tree bark. There is a fair bit of water, but not quite as much plant life as you saw in Vanaheim or in Alfheim. It seems that this water did a bit more to carve the rocks up a bit. A lot of the plants are reminiscent of lichens, and some places have sections of crystals attached which glow when the dragons breathe fire on them. It seems that the dragons do this to combat the somewhat chilly climate within the realm. Through the heart of Asgard runs a river. If anything, it almost appears nearly man-made, like an aqueduct of some sort. But this must have been dragons just tunneling. The river keeps going after the rock wall ends, and perhaps it's a way to get to Vanaheim. Behind you is the way back to your own world. The ice above it is fairly thin, so it's a little alarming, but a long tunnel and a large archway that are quite colorful when the light hits the icy ceiling just right. And that is Asgard, and that is my coverage of the realms as we made the maps. Hope you guys all have a good night.